Thank you so much for joining this third webinar on multilingual education in the primary years, approaches from around the world. I'm Dheer Jingran. I'm the founder and director of Language and Learning Foundation. I'm really happy to get this opportunity to moderate this webinar with two leading international experts on language education and multilingual education. I will introduce them shortly. I've been a strong and long-standing advocate for the inclusion of children's home and first languages in primary education through a multilingual approach in India. When Language and Learning Foundation was first set up in 2015, this was included as one of our 4 core beliefs and continues to be so. We all know that the path towards designing high-quality multilingual education programs at scale and implementing them is not easy. But our commitment to what is best for young children's learning and development keeps us going. The new education policy in India 2020 has provided a strong basis to renew our efforts towards including children's home languages in primary education and beyond. I'm a member of the National Steering Committee, which is developing a new national curriculum framework, and we are having a very lively debate on the curriculum design that can be based on a multilingual pedagogy. Let me stop here and introduce our two international experts. I'm sure it will be a great learning experience for all of us to listen to them and interact with them. First, Dr. Carol Benson. She's a specialist in first language-based multilingual education. Dr. Benson started her career as an elementary school teacher and became deeply interested in language and education policy and social justice. She conducted research in bilingual education as part of her master's and PhD studies. Dr. Benson has combined academic work with technical assistance in multilingual education for non-dominant languages in multilingual countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific, Latin America, and Africa regions. She was based at the Stockholm University, Sweden, from 1998 to 2012, and later was Associate Professor of International and Comparative Education at Teachers College, Columbia University from 2014 to 2022. I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Benson on numerous occasions, and I've always admired her passion for multilingual education. Moving on, our second expert and panelist today is Dr. Paola Uccelli, Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the US. Dr. Uccelli is also co-faculty director of the PhD program at the School of Education at Harvard. With a background in linguistics, she studies socio-cultural and individual differences in language and literacy development throughout the school years. Dr. Uccelli studied linguistics and earned her doctoral degree in human development and psychology at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her current projects focus on language development specifically related to elementary and middle school stages. She's also working to understand how monolingual and multilingual speakers and writers learn to use a variety of discourse structures flexibly and effectively for diverse communicative and learning purposes. Dr. Uccelli conducts her research projects in schools in the US and several other countries in Latin America. She also heads the Language for Learning research team at the Harvard School of Education. Both Dr. Benson and Dr. Uccelli also support the Language and Learning Foundation as global advisors. For this panel, we will follow a format of starting with the moderator, that's me, asking questions of the two panelists, and then we will have a few questions from the audience and wind up with a few closing remarks from the panel. So let me begin right away. The first question is for Dr. Benson, and if I can call you Carol. Carol, sure. So we hear about multilingual education programs being implemented successfully in different parts of the world, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And I know you've been associated personally with several of them in an advisory capacity. Could you share with us one experience that of a successful program that has been implemented at some scale, and you think that has good learning for India and some other countries? Carol.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. And it's really nice to be here and to support Language and Learning Foundation in this way. I think I do have a real passion for supporting, especially what we call non-dominant languages, or languages that were not given a lot of support during colonial times and then post-colonial times, and still suffer from not having so many materials written in them and not being so available for people to use in literacy. So that has been my passion for a very long time, and I'm very interested in what you're doing in India. I thought I would share, there's actually two countries that I thought I would share a little bit about what they're doing. One is the Philippines, which now has a national policy for multilingual education. I think it was 2017. Someone might correct me on the year that policy came about, but it has suffered a little bit in recent history due to a political statement made by its new president. So while the Philippines is sort of rolling out based on demand and based on what they can do, multilingual education using quite a few different Filipino languages. Many of you will know that there are many languages spoken in the Philippines. So they've done it in a sort of decentralized way. But there is always this kind of political threat of just stopping it and going back to, in their case, English, a dominant language. So I wanted to share that there are a lot of really good things happening at the local and district levels because of a lot of committed people who can read and write their own languages. So in that case, I think they've been doing a good job, but at the same time, they've suffered at the local levels from lack of resources, and they don't always get the funding and the budget that they need from the central level. So that can cause a little bit of a sort of negative backwash in some cases. If they're not doing a good job of MLE, then people might call for going back to just the English, which is a foreign language for most children in the Philippines. Another case that I thought I'd just mention briefly, and we may go back to it, is the case of Senegal. Senegal has had a situation, even though French is formally their official language, post-colonial language, but many of the national languages spoken in Senegal also have been given a special status if they have enough written materials and also the grammars and orthography sort of developed enough. So there are 7 or 8 of those languages that are going to be used quite widely in a multilingual education approach. And that has just received sort of national policy status. So the implementation will be rolling out starting next year. I will talk a little bit more about that approach later because they did some very innovative things with how they used the home language and the additional languages, but I'll save that for another moment.
Thank you, Carol. Very reassuring to know that there's work happening in other parts of the world, and some of it is really being adopted widely. It's very reassuring. In India, we've got about 30 languages used as mediums of instruction. But of course, we have a much larger number of languages, and as you said, non-dominant languages, yes. And that is still something we are struggling with. So thank you for your inputs. Moving on, Dr. Uccelli, Paula, if I may. In India, we have some experience with bilingual and multilingual education programs. We've also heard of some work in multicultural education, which we do not understand too well. Could you please share with our audience if multicultural and multilingual education are different, and if so, how? Paula.
Of course, dear. Thank you very much for this invitation. And it's a total pleasure to be here and to be in the company of your inspiring Language and Learning Foundation team, and in the company of Professor Carol Benson, whose work I admire very much and have actually integrated very much in my own writing recently. So thank you for the invitation. Just to give a little bit of background, I'm originally from Peru. I came to do graduate work in the US. And so I live bilingually on a daily basis, right? I have a bilingual family. We speak Spanish at home. And so I live in this bilingual world all the time. And as we know, the work that you are doing there, the research that Carol does, these are such important initiatives. As you know well, we have 370 million children going to school in a language that they don't understand. And this is in a report where the Language and Learning Foundation is actually featured as one great initiative. So on the question specifically of multilingual versus multicultural education, the basic distinction would be that in multilingual education, children are learning in a second or third language, in two or more languages. In multicultural education, the idea is that education needs to attend to the diversity of cultures represented at school, and that includes the languages, but it does not necessarily entail learning in a second or third language or in multiple languages. So on the one hand, if we think about a bilingual or multilingual education, we can think about transitional bilingual education, right? Children start learning in the first language and transition to a second language. And that happens early on, typically in the early primary schools years. Maintenance bilingual education is when children would do both languages throughout their schooling. And in the US, there's now attention to a new model, which is called dual language education, which is when children learn in both languages sort of in a balanced way, right? Either the half the day in one language and half the day in another, or some courses are in one language and some others in others. And that takes two forms. You could have two-way dual language education, which is you have half the kids of one are native in one language and half the kids are native in a second language. And so that also in itself promotes learning from each other. So I'm sure your audience knows about that, but multicultural education in the US in particular has had many different goals and aims and many different implementations. So on the one hand, it's been an effort to teach and include in the curriculum different cultures and different beliefs and ways of being, so that the dominant culture and the dominant view is not the only one represented. That's expected to promote appreciation, tolerance, and respect for cultural diversity, and is supposed to contribute to more peaceful, diverse societies. On the other hand, another way in which multicultural education has been thought about and implemented is thinking not only to promote cultural diversity, but actually to do what has been called culturally responsive pedagogy, which is to represent the culture of the kids who are at school in the curriculum, but also not only content in the curriculum, but to transform the structures of school, to transform teacher-student interactions for social justice, to create equitable learning opportunities for all. And so the fact that we have cultural diversity is not only to appreciate cultural diversity, but so that kids from minoritized ethnic and cultural communities and linguistic communities see themselves in the curriculum. And in that way, that promotes their academic achievement. I would say, Lutz and Billings proposed what is called culturally responsive pedagogy. And more recently, Paris and Alim have advanced that and have proposed culturally sustaining pedagogies, which is an interesting approach in moving one step forward to think not only how to offer relevant content, but to think about sustaining and empowering the cultures and the knowledge of kids. So while culturally responsive pedagogy would be, for example, a teacher uses rap that all kids know to teach another subject, to teach some poetry in the curriculum, culturally sustaining pedagogy would actually make the culture and the knowledge of kids the center of the pedagogical enterprise. So Alim has an initiative where he uses hip hop, and the middle schoolers become hip hop graphers, or however you say that word. They study, right, hip hop. Hip hop becomes the source of knowledge. Hip hop becomes a knowledge source in itself that is valued, that is sustained, that is promoted, and that is used for learning. So just to put those together, I think ideally for all multilingual learners, we want both multilingual education and multicultural education, because what happens is including the home language is not enough. We can include kids' home language and yet still not affirm their identities, not affirm their cultures. So in a way, we want a combination of multilingual and multicultural education. But I'll stop right there, dear.
Thank you, Paula. That was a very clear distinction of why just including children's languages may not be adequate. And also, I think I heard this distinction for the first time, moving from just respecting different cultures to culturally sustaining pedagogy, you said culturally responsive and then culturally sustaining pedagogy. So really great insights. And I think we are not doing enough in terms of including children's cultures and sustaining them in our classroom. So I think there's a lot of learning for us there. Thank you, Paula. Move on to Carol again. Carol, you've heard from me as well as from different forums that our experience and our work in India is mainly confined to the first few years of school education. And I've read your writings, heard you speak at different forums where you emphasize that multilingual education is not just for the early grades and must continue for much longer. Can you please explain your stand here?
Yes, thank you for that question, because I feel like I actually have a couple of slides that I can share right now about that, because I was going to address that. So this relates to what I have criticized and others have criticized before me about approaches to education that prioritize monolingualism, or actually just focus on the dominant language. And we know that parents are really interested in having their children learn dominant languages because of the access that it gives them to perceived access that it gives them to further education and also jobs. But I like to just share these kinds of quotes with people and India is a great example. Pretty much everyone is more than bilingual, right? Multilingual, or gaining multilingual skills. And I think these are the skills that we will need for the 21st century. We will need literacy in those skills. So if we think of multilingualism as a resource and something that the school really wants to promote or wants to support, I have the next slide is about issues that I think are created by having this kind of monolingual habitus, and something that we want to fight against. And one of those things Paula mentioned transitional programs, or programs that just focus mainly on getting children away from speaking their own languages and into speaking dominant languages. You often see these early exit where only home languages or home languages are only used for 1 or 2 years. And we call those subtractive models because they're taking away home languages really and rushing kids into dominant languages, which they're not ready to speak yet. You also see this, and I'm going to criticize EGRA a bit here. You see this focus on early reading skills, years 1 to 3, only mainly decoding, reading, instead of really developing multiliteracies, developing children's skills in their own languages, giving them a strong foundation in languages that are familiar to them, so that they have skills that they can transfer to additional languages as they learn them. And it takes time. And you've pointed out that they're not always in a multilingual environment that includes dominant languages. And so it takes time for them and exposure for them to learn additional languages. And then the other thing, that while I'm criticizing EGRA a bit, there's been this real focus internationally on large-scale assessment instead of looking at formative or diagnostic means for the teacher to find out what his or her children are learning and can build on. What are those skills that kids can build on? And really to focus on making a classroom, designing a classroom that works for speakers of diverse languages or speakers of non-dominant languages in general. I think I had one. A colleague from the Spanish Basque Country and I have claimed that the new education for all should be multilingual education for all. And we really mean all here. We should not be raising children who are monolingual in any language. And then, this is based on what we know from a lot of research, Cummins' principles of linguistic interdependence, that any literacy skills that are built up in familiar languages do transfer to other languages. Also, you could say that skills that are developed in additional languages can sort of back transfer to home languages. And then there's some very interesting work in Europe being done on how people who speak more than 2 languages actually have a very new condition. They call it a dynamic system, it means that 1 language plus 1 language plus 1 language is much more than 3 languages because of the awareness that it gives you of how languages are constructed and so on. This is kind of the future, I think, of bilingual or multilingual education, that if we're really doing a good job throughout at least primary and hopefully beyond, that we're really building on those skills. We're not using home languages for a very short time and then removing them from the curriculum, but we're actually continuing to develop all of the languages that we feel young people will need to have a good life in the future. So I'll stop sharing there, but that was what I was thinking with regard to promoting a multilingual habitus and really thinking about what learners will need in their futures.
Thank you, Carol. So, we have to be very cautious about approaches which remove the children's language, the primary language, very early, and also ensure that languages develop in the classroom together, and several languages, several literacies. That's very crucial, and I think that's something we tend to forget at times, and very focused on starting with a home language often, and then quickly moving on to the second language or the state or regional language. So I think a great point of caution. Thank you so much, Carol. Paula, may move to a slightly different topic, and also looking at the work that you have done on academic language. Can you just explain this concept to our audience of what is academic language? Because very often, since we are focused on primary or even early primary, we are focused on early work, early literacy, early language development. So how long does this academic language take to develop? Why is it so important? And are there implications of this, the academic language, for using home and school languages in primary education?
Sure, dear. Thank you very much. Let me just tell you briefly how I got to this topic, which I now call analytical language. I call the language of academic texts, or the language of content area texts. And truly, I started in my early in my career. I was studying very early Spanish acquisition with little kids, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and also young children's narrative development in Spanish and English, bilingual kids. And it was actually in the context, I was doing a postdoc as part of a project. And as part of that work, I accompanied a 5th grade teacher throughout a year in what it's called in the US a sheltered immersion English class, which is for newcomers to the US who are speakers of other languages. They come to this sheltered, in some cases, sheltered English immersion. And I was accompanying Mr. Mata, who was the teacher of those 5th graders throughout the year. And what became very clear to me is that kids who could communicate very fluently with their peers in the cafeteria, in many different contexts, when confronted with text, were having terrible difficulties. And what was interesting to me there, I'm a linguist, and so I look at everything through language, right? But what was interesting for me is that people around were not seeing that language was the issue. Kids were being assigned to reading strategy, to learning difficulties, treatments. And so I became very interested in this relationship between language and reading. And of course, my work is not new. Cummins have been talking about this distinction since the, late 60s or 70s. What I did in my work was try to sort of make it more concrete. What skills are we talking about when we are talking about these skills? And that's where I started to work on this. And let me just also share some slides so that I can perhaps illustrate this a little better for the audience. Let me just move here to that. So in a way, I've been doing this work for more than 10 years. And what my work shows, the data and data from other sources, is that to achieve equity and excellence in education, paying attention to language beyond the home language is sort of that continuing development of language, whether you are monolingual or a multilingual learner. In a way, my work places everybody, even teachers, even researchers, all of us as language learners, right? And my work, I think for me, shows that without understanding the immense variability in language skills that kids bring to school, we actually run the risk of replicating or even exacerbating the differences in society. What we know from research there in thinking about reading, where we have done a lot of research in the last years, we meaning the field, not me, is that word recognition skills require explicit instruction. That's absolutely necessary. But actually the harder is the language comprehension and the content knowledge, but we'll focus on language here. So why is language so important? In a way, this is why we all continue to be language learners, because this idea that we learn Spanish as a full language or English as a full language is actually a misconception. What we learn are ways of using language in different contexts. So the way you communicate with your kids, with your parents, with your close friends is very different than the way we are communicating right now in this webinar, or the way you communicate with your boss, or the way you communicate in different contexts. So what happens is that language learning then continues throughout adolescence and potentially throughout life. Again, even if you are a monolingual, because we learn all these different ways of using language. In a way, I like to think of us all as multilinguals in a way, even if we speak one language, right? But the interesting thing developmentally is that while we might be very skilled users of language in one context, you might be super skilled with your friends and telling sophisticated narratives and ironic stories and engaging your audience deeply. you might not be equally skilled in other contexts. For example, in understanding the language of text. And so because the academic communities, the educational context is what I care about, I started to think about what could be an additional piece that could move the needle for the important literacy skills that Carol was talking about, right? In one language, in multiple languages. So in reading, we have had a lot of work done. So there is word recognition in intervention work, right? Teaching the word recognition skills, teaching reading comprehension strategies, teaching vocabulary. And these are absolutely essential, but have proven insufficient. So what is still complicated is to move the needle for upper elementary and middle school kids. And so the hypothesis that I had was, well, beyond vocabulary, there might be other language skills that might still be challenging for kids, even in the adolescent years, right? And so I'll share just a couple of more slides to illustrate the construct. So kids bring more conversational language as they bring more colloquial and everyday knowledge to school. And they encounter school texts that contain more information-dense language. So as they are learning new content, they are also learning that new content through new language. And so the hypothesis was what I call this core analytical language skills, sort of the useful language resources that cut across social studies, science. Those might still be difficult for kids. So the hypotheses were two, that we would find individual differences, even for adolescents, in the knowledge of this language. You know, there are many misconceptions there about how kids learn language. And we think kids are sponges who learn language easily and fast. And we think that, you know, language learning is completed early on, and then we focus on other things. And what my work shows, and the work of many others, is that language continues throughout. And so the two hypotheses were that we would find individual differences, even in adolescents, in the knowledge of language, like, you know, connectives like consequently or words like evidence, and that these individual differences would help us understand why so many kids in the world continue to struggle with literacy and reading comprehension. So just to give a very quick, I don't think we need to go over this in detail, but just to give you a sense of the concrete language resources that we identified. Connectives such as moreover, these are the kinds of words that are in text so that they help readers understand the relationships between ideas. But of course, they're going to be helpful only if kids understand the function of those connectives, right? And we assume that to be the case. The same with nominalization, syntax, and stance markers. I won't go into detail on that. But basically, what we have found is indeed striking individual differences in students' analytical language skills, even in grade 8. So this is where kids are 13 or 14 years of age. Many of these words and structures that we use in text and in teaching, kids don't know, right? And so what happens also is that we have found these skills to be highly predictive of reading comprehension, even when we control for word recognition, for vocabulary, for sociodemographic skills. And what I think is we have consistent results in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese. We have developed the instrument that we developed, and we have worked closely with schools in this. Before this project, I had always analyzed discourse. That's what I wanted to do. But we worked in partnership with schools. And so schools told us, if you want to study language, then you have 45 minutes to come and evaluate our kids. So we had to develop an instrument. And now we have this very strong evidence base that these skills actually are not necessarily, and practices, I would say, are not necessarily mastered because we are not providing the opportunities for kids to master those. And on the bilingual front, we have data to show that for dual language learners, Spanish CALs, these skills actually predict reading comprehension. And that's even when we account for English. So if you learn these skills in one language, we only have data on Spanish and English for now. We're working on a Chinese version. We're working on different pieces. But for now, from Spanish and English, if you know these skills, you can transfer that, and that helps you in a second language. So let me just stop the slides so that we can come back to the conversation. But what I want to emphasize, though, is that these language resources can only be promoted in the context of affirming kids' identities and multilingual resources. So it's not separate from that. And that's where I was sort of combining the multilingual and multicultural. It has to be embedded in affirming kids' languages and cultures. And actually, you were asking how long does it take to develop these sort of additional resources. And yes, we have data that says, it might take 5 to 7 years, but that's exactly what I'm trying to improve, because I think we need better instructional methods to do that. And in a way, what happens is that it's a moving target, right? As kids go up in grades, the content and the language gets harder. And so they need support throughout, because it's not the same language, but the language and the content are becoming increasingly harder. And so that's why learning to read in the early grades is not sort of an inoculation method that now we are done, but we need to continue to accompany kids to learn how to read as they move forward. And a final thought, that we learn language by using language and by speaking. And so why are kids...
And reading and writing.
Exactly. And so why are kids not learning this language in school, which is the language of school? Because they're silent, because they're not engaged, because we're not giving them the opportunities to practice this in one language, in multiple languages, and to show them the value of that, right? So I'll stop there. Sorry for that long answer.
No, thank you, Paula. I think the very important message was that language learning continues throughout life, and then these analytical language skills, of school text, which is a dense sentence structure, specialized vocabulary, if that is not mastered, early grade reading is not going to be enough to be doing well at school. I think that's a very important message. And I think we're all guilty, including the Language and Learning Foundation, on trying to focus on foundational literacy and early literacy, and after that, and kids still don't do well much later, and there's a gap there of what happens in later primary and middle stages, which is not attended to. So very important. Thank you so much.
Could I add to what you just said? Please. Because I think that was really, it was a great summary, and also I really appreciate what Paula has been saying. The one of the things that's very well developed in North American settings is, especially for Spanish and English, teaching for transfer. So there are a lot of charts and materials that do this comparison contrast of the two languages, not just vocabulary, but also structure, sentence structure, all kinds of aspects. And that's what you need, right? You need this kind of comparison and contrast as children are learning additional languages, so that they can take their familiar language and see which aspects of that language are similar or different from other languages. And those are the things I think we need to develop in our other bi and multilingual contexts, is those kinds of charts and even that way of thinking to help teachers teach for transfer. So I now completely avoid the word transition, because transition means taking instruction from using a familiar language to using an unfamiliar language. And that's not what we want to do. We want to promote transfer. which is building on literacy skills that they're developing. And the other point that I think is really important here is it's not just oral. It's really dependent on reading and writing. And I think one of the other issues that I have with the EGRA measurement is that it focuses on receptive skills, taking someone else's language and decoding it, instead of asking learners to actually express themselves. So looking at writing and looking at interacting with print. So those are other aspects that are very important and that we want to continue throughout primary, if not beyond. So I'm always saying, hopefully primary, but even beyond that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Carol. I think the messages are really reinforcing each other from both of you, that it's not just a question of doing something in early grades and somehow including children's languages, their cultures, their identity, also continuing work on literacy and also developing strong, academic language skills. So that's very important. And therefore, multilingual education is not just about doing something in the early grades. That's very crucial. Thank you so much.
If I could add just one final thought to build on Carol's point, that sort of bridging across languages, explicit, those charts that she's talking about, Spanish and English, are crucial to support kids. This doesn't happen spontaneously, right? Instruction can play a key role. And this is precisely where I think we could shorten the time and we could accompany children as they move to harder content and harder language throughout schooling. But I just wanted to emphasize that it doesn't happen spontaneously as we often think. That point that Carol was bringing is very important.
Just a follow-up question, these kind of charts or understanding the equivalence, compare and contrast and understand how languages are different and similar, at what age or grade do you think children can start doing it for themselves, of course with support, but they can start understanding this and, what we call sort of meta-linguistic skills? Is there, in your experience, an age or grade by which it's...
I've worked very closely with dual language schools here in Boston. And so the way it works is also this what they call in the dual language school I work with, they call it bridging. And so the bridging itself is developmentally, right? So they do it from the very start, because they would do, for example, science on one week in Spanish and the next week in English. And so they don't repeat the content that they have taught the prior week. They do some bridging to translate some words, and they highlight cognates, and they highlight some structures that are relevant for discussion, and they move on. So that bridging can happen developmentally at the grade level, at the content level, and with the key pieces that they need to continue that instruction. Does that make sense there?
Okay. Yes. It is, it adds to our understanding of how this, children can begin to work with languages. Sure. Thank you so much. And I saw my colleague Medhavi put on her video. I think that's the indication that we shift for about 5 to 7 minutes for questions that we've received from the audience. And then I'd request both panelists to round this up with brief comments at the end. So please think of what you haven't managed to say, what's very important. We'll come back to you in about 5 to 7 minutes. Over to you, Medhavi.
Hi, thank you so much for an enriching session so far. We have some questions from our audience members. The first question we have, it is by Mr. Gurunath Godar from Azim Premji Foundation. So he's asking, there are many challenges for a teacher in the Indian classroom, such as diverse languages of the children, culture, and lack of resources and teacher readiness. So how feasible is multilingual education in primary years? I would invite Dr. Uccelli to answer this question.
Yes, thank you, Medhavi. Such an important question, and I think a question that is relevant in many places around the world, right? And perhaps, again, the concepts of both multilingual and multicultural education are relevant here. I think, of course, we cannot expect that all teachers will speak all the children's languages, right? But there is a very different stance. I mean, this is where I absolutely value the concept that Carol Benson has offered to the field of multilingual habitus. You can have a multilingual habitus even if you don't speak all of your students' languages. It's a very different attitude to present the world as multilingual and multicultural. In a way, if you think about it, in education, we misinform children and the world about language and culture. We create these contexts that assume that the world is monocultural and monolingual, which it is not usually for even teachers, students, or the communities we serve. So I think even that shift in stance, in attitude, to understand that we have multilingual, multicultural children in the classroom, and then how to think about using multilingual and multicultural resources, skills and practices as resources is an enormous shift. And this could take many different forms, right? It's very different. Actually, children love when you don't know something as a teacher, right? So having kids teach you a few words from their language, having their languages represented in the classroom and in the school, having family liaison that can communicate with the communities in the family so that the children perceive their parents and their families as knowledgeable, as welcome, as listened to in the context of school. That's a long, it's an important first step, which is absolutely not minor. I can offer perhaps a few sort of more concrete initiatives that are happening in the US. So there are initiatives that are trying to present in these contexts projects or activities that involve collaborative learning and can incorporate the languages of children, even if the teacher does not understand them, right? So one beautiful initiative is called Poetry Inside Out, and that's done by Park and Michaels and O'Connor. And what they do is bring children from multiple languages to translate a poem. Now, the poem is written in a language that none of the children understand. I mean, it's a very interesting methodology. They offer a glossary, they offer a little bit of context, and kids have to discuss among themselves what translation of this poem they will produce. There's no correct answer. There is a collaborative learning mode, and there's a challenge that they have, and they can bring their insights from their own languages. So they talk about language, they can share in their own languages if they share a language, and the teacher then, of course, witnesses the product that they produce. There is another project that it's emerging that I think is very promising, which is called the Translate Project. This is led by Emily Phillips Galloway and her colleagues at Vanderbilt, and it also uses collaborative project sort of problem-solving learning and provide some guides to teachers who don't speak the children's languages to ask questions such as, why is in your translation you have 5 words, but the original text had 7 words? Why is that? And things like that that could sort of provoke interesting conversations, even when the teacher does not share the language of the kids. So I think this is an area where we need absolutely more work, where we need insights from teachers who are in the classroom daily, from teams like yours at the Language Learning Foundation, to get creative insights on how to deal with this. But I do think there's a lot that can be done, even when teachers do not share their children's languages.
Thank you, Dr. Uccelli. I believe the references that you used will be very helpful for our audience. Thank you for answering that question. Moving on, we have the next question by Mr. Satvik Ori from Vidya Bhavan Education Resource Center. So Mr. Satvik is asking, how do we use different languages and scripts in the class as a resource? How do we use students' first language in a class to teach a second language, especially in L2, which is language, second language, impoverished environment? I would request Dr. Carol to take this question up.
Yeah, thanks. I love these questions. And I really also want to give some responsibility and credit to the people who are every day trying to deal with situations like this in their own creative ways. So first of all, we should probably recognize that there's a lot of creative work being done already in India and other multilingual contexts. I can give a couple of examples from different countries, and Paula already mentioned some great processes in the classroom. But structurally speaking, there are different things that can be done. For example, using classroom aides who are family members or older children who already maybe have some literacy skills in children's own languages, or the L1, as we call it, which isn't always their L1, but a familiar language. The problem with classroom aides is that teachers don't always know how to work with them. And it also creates this situation where maybe the teacher is associated with a dominant language and high status, and the aides are associated with the non-dominant languages and lower status. So it's a kind of, if you're thinking about culturally sustaining pedagogies, it might not be the way that you would want to conduct your pedagogy. But there are other models that, in fact, I think we have to get away from our, one teacher, one classroom kind of modality, because there's a lot of options for perhaps having teachers who are literate in different languages in the same school. Maybe they trade students around. Kimo Kotsonen has written about some schools in Southeast Asia that experimented with conducting at least the morning sessions by language, in rooms by language, organized by language rather than age. So there are really a lot of different things that could be done with some creativity and willingness to be flexible and not do the same kind of traditional thing over and over. One thing that I'll mention, I said I'd mention what Senegal did with the support. It was the ministry with support of a non-governmental organization that's really specialized in using Senegalese national languages. And what they did for some years is what they called a simultaneous bilingual model in the primary school, where they had, for any hour of a lesson, so language arts or mathematics, the first half hour was spent in the Senegalese language, the non-dominant language like Wolof or Pulaar. And then the second half of the class was spent sort of immediately transferring a lot of that knowledge into French, the dominant language in that case. So they were doing this kind of simultaneous bilingual and biliteracy model. It sounds crazy, but they actually had quite good success with it. And at the end, just to share the results of that program, they had almost 100% passing rate from primary and almost 100% going on to secondary, which is sort of unheard of in that setting. Usually education is only in French, a foreign language for all children, and for teachers as well. And the passing rate is something under 50%. So they were able to sort of use both languages and kind of promote transfer right away. It sounds crazy, but they did a very good job with it. And the last thing I'll say about that, and I know that in many situations in India, you'll have schools that have multiple languages spoken. Senegal has the same situation. And what they did, at least for this program that I'm talking about, is they had meetings with parents that ahead of time, and the community itself decided which of the languages they were going to choose. So they were forced to choose a language so that they knew which materials they were getting. And which teachers were going to be teaching there. But the communities themselves decided, and we met 2 communities that actually changed their mind after a couple of years. But anyway, they made that decision. And then we talked to parents who spoke other languages at home. But so their children were in, say, a Wolof medium school that was using Wolof and then the dominant language French. And this one Bainuk speaking father, I remember very, very clearly, he said, now I see that my kids can learn to read and write in a Senegalese language. And when I see them coming home with reading and writing materials in Wolof, then I realized, wait, I can teach them our own language, reading and writing, because he knew he had been to literacy classes. So he was teaching them their own language at home. Now, I know that not all families are in a position to do that, but I do want to use that story to show that choosing one language does not mean you're excluding other languages. It might open the door to including families' own languages. Sorry for that long answer, but I hope that's helpful.
I believe our audience members are making a lot of notes, and thank you for sharing all the strategies and the anecdotes as well. Oh, yes. So moving on, I would go on and talk about our last question, which is shared by Mr. Santosh Kumar from Save the Children. So he's asking, how do we see the future of FLN implementation, which is foundational literacy and numeracy implementation, in line with multilingual education, especially in tribal pockets? Now, I would request Dr. Dheer to take this question up.
I actually don't want to come in the way of our 2 experts and this, but I'll just take 30 seconds. I think we should understand that FLN and doing multilingual education are not separate things. We've got to have a multilingual approach for foundational learning as well. And that's very important, especially in tribal areas, because the children's understanding of the language that is currently the medium of instruction is limited or absolutely not there. So it's very important to start with the foundation of children's first language, especially in these areas. And also, of course, have appropriate practices to develop the second language as well, which over the few years. I do think that it's very important to have in such pockets a teacher who knows the children's language or languages, because that's very important, because there is otherwise nothing that can link the children with. And the second thing would be to have good children's literature. And there's a lot of work happening in India in different languages to have storybooks, posters, poems, and big books in a lot of these languages that not only affirms the children's languages, but also allows for a lot of oral language work that can happen, because that's a stimulus that's available to teachers to use. So I think this is very important in tribal pockets. And I'll close here. And we now, for the panelists, I just you'll have to wind up in 1 minute each. So just any remarks that you have for the before we close, and Medhavi will close the whole session. So over to you, Carol, and then Paula.
Okay, I think what you just said is so important, dear. And I'm sorry that I forgot to mention teacher languages and literacies proficiencies. So those are things that we can develop, but we need to know how teachers are placed in the schools and how they, how the schools manage their teachers. So that's one area that I'm really interested in working on now is teacher placement and management of teachers and by their language skills, even if it's self-reported language and literacy skills. I think it's really important. They could be using the Common European framework, to sort of rank their own language and literacy skills. It would be so nice to have teacher language profiles as part of their personnel files, however placement is done. It may be done more informally if it's done locally, like through school districts. Probably the district education people know those teachers well, and they know they can make sure that there's some matches there. but we also need to promote teacher proficiencies in the additional languages that they're teaching. So I really respect that. And then I thought I should just share one picture, if I may, just very quickly of what a Senegalese classroom looks like, since we were talking about promoting transfer and comparison, like just always having the alphabet charts on the walls. I just think that's one step. And it sort of adds, I think you've been talking about those kinds of things, dear, having big books and other materials that teachers can use. If there's always some kind of resources on the walls that students can refer to, I think that's helpful as well. So thank you, and I've really enjoyed sharing here.
Thank you, Carol. Paula?
Yes, thank you, dear. Perhaps I'll share more of a big picture idea, and I also would like to share one slide quickly. Let me just move this to the. So I think, in thinking about language, one of the contributions I'm trying to make is this idea, dear, that you were suggesting precisely of language learning as continuing in one language and multiple languages. And I think we need to move from what or Gabi Oliveira would call silencing pedagogies to what I'm calling now pedagogies of voice, right? And so where we need to bring students to discuss texts, to do a discussion of ideas, to do collaborative projects where they use the languages to think and to do a work at school actively, right? They are not only listening so that they can learn to master the languages for particular purposes. And I just want to emphasize, at school, even in bilingual education, we could use language to silence a child or to affirm a child's voice. We can use language to distance people or to actually foster trusting relationships, or to abstract learning or to amplify learning, and in general to suppress agency or to actually empower agency. And when we empower kids, then they are also more engaged with learning. So the one thing I call for is to understand that when we're teaching language, that's embedded in a sociocultural context with identities, with emotions, and we need to think about kids and all of us as hybrid identities, fluid, multiple identities. And interesting and perhaps thought-provoking is that language shouldn't be the goal itself. We need larger goals of thinking, of conceptual challenge, of a project that are meaningful, and language is very much thought about strategically, but not necessarily as the ultimate goal. And perhaps one final, somewhat counterintuitive thought is that when we engage kids in cognitively challenging or cognitively demanding content and work with the language supports, actually language is also learned better. So it is not sort of bringing down the expectations and the materials. On the contrary, we need to do cognitively challenging work with the language as support. And that tends to be the best way in which kids are not only learning, but engaged as learners.
Thank you. And I will not try and summarize this very rich conversation, just that message that kept coming from both of you, that it is not just about the techniques of bilingual, multilingual education, and it is really about affirming children's identities, ensuring that they have a voice, organizing this in the classroom. So thank you so much to Carol and Paula. And I have taken copious notes, and I'm sure the audience has learned a lot. I would actually, if you agree, we could circulate your slides as in a mailer after the follow-up. And over to you, Medhabi, to close the.
Thank you so much. I feel so honored to be a part of this beautiful learning experience that you three have created today. And I believe our audience is too. So again, thank you so much for agreeing to participate and creating this session for us here. With this, we conclude our first webinar series on multilingual education. While our first two webinars focused a lot on deep diving into the Indian context, today with our third one, we explored the global perspectives too. So thank you. Moving on, I would first really thank all our audience members who have been with us and also for asking such great questions, which helped us deep dive even more into the perspective that we're trying to learn. And I believe we will be back with another webinar series very soon and discuss important topics like we did in this theme about multilingual education. And with this, I would thank once again, all of you here and our speakers in the previous panels as well for just creating this learning experience for us and also helping us learn more about multilingual education. With this, I would close the session and thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was so enjoyable, and I look forward to learning about the insights that you produce, and in collaboration with teachers in India. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thanks again.
Thank you.
All the best to you.